Thank you. First of all, I've got great experience with I have a lot of experience. I can't say it's great experience with cottonwood trees, having 7 of them in my backyard, and had a lot of limb drops. And indeed, the city's tree retention requirements are rather strict, and so every time I went to the city after a limb drop, and I mean a limb that came through the roof and into a room below, and I asked to remove the trees, and I was told they were healthy trees. That happens with healthy trees. And finally, after the 4th one, and my house became uninsurable, I went to the city, and they said, well, let's take a look at some of these issues. And so the question I have for you, Dave, is, and maybe perhaps you can talk a little bit about this, because it is unique to poplars and cottonwoods, but the problem of crowning, which is when you prune or top a tree, that it grows out of that cutting area and creates new limbs that are actually weaker and have weaker joints and create additional problems. Are you familiar with the term?
Yes, actually you just described it perfectly. Yeah, I mean basically that's what happens. So your new limbs that come off of a area that was cut are more weakly attached, so they're more prone to actually fail.
And this was one of my concerns when my experience with pruning and topping trees has been singularly unsuccessful, and as a result, finally, the city agreed to allow me to remove these dangerous trees. As I say, when you have 4 limbs actually come through and pierce the bottom, go all the way into the bottom floor, that gets a little bit scary, and when it happens routinely. I still get limbs falling. Fortunately, they haven't been piercing the roof because they haven't been that big. But some of the proposals that have been offered in terms of how we deal with this essentially would exacerbate the problem.
It could, for sure. Yeah, I mean, one of the worst things you can do for a tree is actually top it.
Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Tuchek. Also, thank you, everybody who's come to speak tonight. I appreciate the opportunity to hear a little bit more about how everybody's feeling. I had a couple questions that I didn't get answered earlier. It was quite a bit close to the meeting, so I apologize for that if you haven't gotten a copy of these, but I had a question regarding the SEPA checklist. If
Right.
this project would be considered categorically excluded?
So it was exempt.
Okay.
So I filled out the application, and then the planner that reviewed it determined it as being exempt.
Okay. And then I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more about, you'd mentioned there was a Fish and Wildlife approval.
Right.
What is the process that the city is required to go through? If you might be able to explain that to the folks that are listening, that would be really helpful so we can understand how that approval process
Yeah, so actually, there wasn't a formal process to follow, so that we heard and we observed that there were a lot of citizens that were concerned about the eagles, and we have seen eagles in the park. So we wanted to make sure that we were in compliance with the 1940 Bald and Golden Eagle Act. I wasn't familiar with that particular act before this project, but
No, there's no talk from the audience at this point.
So I contacted the United States Fish and Wildlife Department to find out and get clarification in terms of what rules and regulations we needed to be concerned with.
Okay, and then I think the other thing that would be really helpful is that if there's since we are a body that looks at policy and budget type decisions, the type of question I actually had was related to your comment that we can't afford to wait for the risk. And so I'm wondering if there's actually a number that we're working with in terms of the cost of the risk versus the $60,000 project that we are going forward with here. So
I would say no. I think Dave's comments about the target are very important here, that this is a high population area. And so while only one person was hit, or actually 2 people were kind of hit last summer, because of the crowds that gather at this park, the decision is either to block off half or more of the park, but really the assessment is because it's a target-rich area, that's why the risk is so high of a person becoming injured from just one branch falling. Is there anything to add to that, Dave?
Well, I would just say that, yeah, in situations like this, we don't, look at percentages or really dollar amounts or that type of a thing. We just really look at the potential of somebody getting seriously injured, and that's how we assess all of our risks that we see in the parks.
Sure. So I guess my question is related to time then. What's the risk of waiting a little bit longer to get additional public input on this project?
So I think, the timing, the highest risk is during the summer. I've invited literally everybody that has called me and talked to me to give me additional ideas on how we can address this situation. I haven't heard anything that would change my mind at all. There's the solutions are not feasible. They're still risky. Retaining some trees and taking some, the risk is still there. And the bottom line is once we identify that there's a risk like this, we need to act upon it. We can't just leave it.
Any further questions?
And one more comment or question about that. And would this also, if we continue with this project on the current timeline, does it? Are we at risk of a window closing for replanting as well?
No.
We're not.
So we're hoping to have the trees removed over the next 4 weeks, and we can plant the trees pretty much anytime. We're going to be manually watering them during the summer, all through the summer.
Thank you.
Mr. Marchison.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you for all the testimony that we received tonight on this topic. The challenge is, I think this is we were presented and you are facing, and the city is facing, is we have a known hazard from these trees. It manifested itself with a member of our community, a couple members of our community being injured and some property damage occurring. Thankfully, it wasn't as bad as it could have been, but we now know we have a hazard. Anybody who works in the risk management field knows that then you have been presented with an opportunity to correct something, and there are ways to mitigate risk, and we have examined those ways to mitigate the risk. We did it last year by basically restricting access to what we thought were perhaps some of them were high risk, for lack of a better term, areas. But we knew that going forward, that was probably not the long-term solution that we were going to be able to do. Otherwise, we'd essentially close part of the park off to public access. And this is a very busy park, from not just from the neighbors of the park, but from all members of the community. So the challenge is, how do we mitigate that risk going forward, knowing that we have it out there? And I think, as much as it pains us, and I, too, have had to take cottonwoods down in my backyard, and they are limb droppers. In the middle of nowhere with no wind, just all of a sudden you find a limb dropped in your back. Fortunately, they were far enough away from the house that they damaged toys, not other property. But so I don't envy, again, the situation that we found ourselves in terms of having to make this decision, but I think in terms of what we as a community should value, and that's protecting our residents first and foremost. And I don't want somebody injured for us to come back and say, gosh, if only we would have taken that tree out, but we would not have had an individual injured. And for God's sakes, I wouldn't want it to be a younger person, anybody, honestly. So I realize it's a difficult challenge that we face, and we have to make sometimes some difficult decisions. So I don't necessarily see us going any other direction at this point in time in terms of removing the trees. And you're only removing the ones that are nearest the beach, as I recall.
No, that's correct.
Yeah.
So there are cottonwoods that are going to be remaining in the park, but they're going to be on the south portion of the park in the natural area, and then also along Idlewood Creek, which has a fence on both sides, and there are cottonwoods that are growing in there, but we don't have any targets in that area.
Any further questions for Mr. Tuchek? Mr. Fields.
So I'm going to just sort of real briefly try to recreate